It's been 20 years since Gundam SEED Destiny released in 2004, and an obscene amount of time since this movie was first announced and they started working on it. Needless to say, it's been a long time coming, but I finally got to see it. The question is, was it actually worth the wait? And don't worry, we're not going to get into any spoilers here. I want everyone to have a chance to see the movie first. Gundam SEED Freedom is packed to the brim with content, action, references, new and returning characters and mobile suits, and even plot points, which can leave it feeling a little bit bloated and poorly paced at times, which is largely my only real issue with the movie. So expanding or condensing certain plot points probably would have done the movie a bit of justice. If this was an OVA series, I think this probably would have been perfect if they gave it about an additional 2 episodes worth, so about 20 to 40 more minutes. Then I think you could have really had the time to have your cake and eat it too. Things escalate quicker than Athrun self-destructs, and that man is a ticking time bomb ready to go off at a moment's notice. We go from small battles to over-the-top typical Gundam stuff with world-ending connotations pretty fast. But the structure is there and understandable, just could have maybe used a bit more breathing room is all. And those references I mentioned earlier can hurt and help with that at the same time. They are the biggest use of fan service this time around, and they come in all different forms. SEED and Destiny are well known for reusing animation, so a lot of people have pictures of those movements in their heads. SEED Freedom pays a lot of homage to some of those iconic attacks and abilities and so on, which can have you jumping from your seat, pointing at the screen, going, I remember when Kira did that before. And a lot of them are done shot to shot almost, in a very intentional and charming way. And as I've mentioned, a lot of returning characters come back around this time, and important characters that are no longer alive have their names dropped in ways that provide a lot of closure. Some key plot points are also directly references in themselves. Notably, returning weapons, tactics, and motivations can contribute to moving things along in a way that's easy to understand, so we don't need to spend the time to explain them if audiences are largely aware of what they already are, which can also create opportunities for great lines. My favorite, that doesn't really directly give you any spoilers, is when a character says that someone or something is in the shadow of Messiah. That sent little tingles down my spine, because it has a lot of literal and figurative meaning to it. But at the same time, I would have liked to see some fresh motivations for key characters to help the movie stand on its own 2 feet a little bit more. But in a different sense, it did really hit the nostalgic part of my brain, especially since I've spent dozens upon dozens of hours rewatching SEED for my recap video I did, and Destiny for the video I'm working on currently. So I constantly was recognizing and finding new things to appreciate in the insane amount of detail packed into this movie. But as a double-edged sword, that may also contribute to why I was wanting to see something a bit more unique this time around. Although, considering it's been 20 years since these characters, motivations, and plot points have been used, I think it's largely forgivable. If you want to see me dive into some of those references, be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss out. Before I touch on characterization, I have to say I'm really pleased with the CG animation in this movie. I'd never been a big fan of CG in anime, which is ironic considering the original SEED used it at certain points, notably with the Archangel, but thankfully they do not make the cardinal sin of using it on characters. It is reserved for battleships and mobile suits only, thank God. And everything feels like it moves exactly like it did in SEED and Destiny. It is a very faithful recreation of the old art style, while also being notably different at the same time. The action in this is some of the best in the franchise, fast and frantic, with a bunch of variety too. And I really appreciate how the Millennium and the Archangel get their time to shine too, because battleships normally don't get too much screen time in combat in the Gundam franchise. It all helped me appreciate the new Gundam designs a lot more. I never had a problem with them, but I was never really particularly in love. But now, I'll say I'm a fan. I think my favorite is probably the Rising Freedom Gundam still. Don't be afraid to let me know which one's your favorite in the comments. And I also very briefly want to talk about the music. They really blew my expectations out of the water. A lot of the new songs are retoolings or remixes of old stuff, which gives a really nostalgic feel, but they're also very unique iterations. I remember thinking to myself about one song and how it kinda sounded like SEED elevator music, But that's a compliment, because I actually really liked how it sounded, if only I could remember which particular song it was. They also have a lot of completely new stuff, such as the track Freedom, which I'm sure you've heard before, which was made by TM Revolution, who is returning from the original series, and so on and so forth. Needless to say, there is a lot of really good music this time around. For a characterization, Kira is obviously going to be the most notable. He feels a lot more in line with how he was in SEED versus Destiny, which makes sense because he's the main character again. He is incredibly stoic in Destiny, silent, quiet. He kind of just fights. He doesn't really have a character arc per se, which is totally fine because he learned his lessons in SEED, and I'm thankful they didn't make him relearn everything again immediately after. In SEED Freedom, he loses a bit of that stoicism. He's a bit more emotional and fleshed out, which not only makes a bit more sense, but is probably for the best. The plot is a lot more personal for him this time around. He's dealing with a lot of guilt after the end of Destiny, and feeling like he isn't enough for the world and those around him, and more spoiler stuff I don't want to talk about yet, obviously. And he's emotional, but not overly emotional. Definitely not to the point of the iconic Kira cry that everyone likes to make fun of. A very reasonable level of emotional for the situations that he's put into. I would say he was handled pretty well in this. I won't dive too much into Lacus because she'll go very much into spoiler territory, but I am happy overall with how they handled her. I was very nervous about what they were doing in some of those trailers, but thankfully it's a bit more understandable in the context of the movie. And of course, we have to talk about our other leading men, Athrun and Shinn. Athrun is largely his typical self. He runs around wanting to kick everyone's ass, and he does so. But that's not a surprise. And he also has some of the best moments in the movie specifically dedicated to him, whether it be the most badass, the funniest, or the most fulfilling. Athrun fans eating good. And Shinn gets a bit of a redemption. He went from a somewhat hateable protagonist into an extremely hateable antagonist by the end of Destiny, to the point of almost blatantly murdering his girlfriend. So it's nice to see him not be so hateable, and instead extremely likable and empathetic. I'm also really happy with other characterization choices in comparison to Destiny as well, whether it be simple things like paying off the end of Destiny by having Shinn and Kira finally fight together, which again we've been waiting for 20 years, or fixing problems that Destiny created with how certain relationships were left at the end, such as Cagalli getting to contribute to the plot again and interact with our cast, instead of getting banished to the sidelines. Stuff like that is amazing, even with the voice actor change. And another small example being simply seeing Maru and Mu live their lives together in some of their more quiet moments. It's such a beautiful thing to see. And based on my Discord, Twitter, and YouTube community polls, it sounds like a lot of you are really loving the movie too. But at the same time, a lot of you haven't had the chance to see it, which is why it's so important to me to make this review spoiler-free. After the movie gets released online and so on, I'll have to do a bit more of a deep dive into it and take a look at everything a bit more closely and see if my opinions end up changing at all. I greatly implore all of you to give it a watch, or maybe even two. If you're a big fan of SEED, there's a lot to love. And I know a lot of people who complain about SEED and Destiny that are still having a blast with this. There were a couple of new characters and plot points that get glossed over though. For example, Agnes didn't get as much setup as I think she may have needed in order for audiences to truly understand her character and motivations, and how they relate to Kira, Shinn, and Lunamaria. So I'd strongly recommend watching my video on the SEED Freedom prequel because it does a great job setting up just that. Or check out my full Gundam SEED recap, so everything's fresh before you check out SEED Freedom.